Thank you very much. It's great to be with you again up here in the Twin Cities. I suppose many of you, if you're basketball fans, you're kind of psyched up about the Timberwolves, huh? Yeah? Okay. Not that I follow, I stopped following the NBA since Michael Jordan left the Bulls, so it's been a while. But I'm excited for you. But I'm excited to talk about the Ice Age. I've been wanting to talk together about the Ice Age for a long time. But then I realized, it kind of helps to have that in a timeline, a biblical timeline context. And of course, you can't have an Ice Age without the flood, and we're going to get into that right away. So we're going to begin with the flood. We're just going to do a little review of some of my other talks. We could spend the whole night just on evidence for a worldwide flood. But let's begin with 2 Peter 1. In 2 Peter, St. Peter is near the end of his life, and he knows it. And he's writing a letter to the church, and he's reminding us of things that he really wants us to remember. And he actually says it 3 times. In verse 12 of chapter 1, I will always be ready to remind you. In the next verse, I want to stir you up by way of reminder. And then in verse 15, after my departure, you will be able to call these things to mind. What does he want us to remember? Well, obviously the first thing is that we're all sinners in need of a Savior and the gospel. But he specifically mentions Noah's flood. We, the church, the believers in God's word, we are to remember Noah's flood. And unfortunately, I think in the last 100 years or so, we don't get many messages about Noah's flood and all the evidence for it. And so I'm glad to see in the last decades a lot more emphasis on that. Because he very clearly, in Peter says, God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And if you're familiar with this, this is where we have like a prediction of most of modern geology, which is uniformitarianism, and it uses the phrase, all continues just as it was from the beginning. This is what the mockers are saying. No, there was no catastrophe. Everything continues in a uniform way, the way we see it today. And of course, Charles Lyell popularized that. And then Peter then says, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. He wants us to remember Noah's flood. It's an important teaching. But we live in a culture that refuses to consider a worldwide flood. Nobody wants to believe it. I hear all the time, even see it in textbooks, oh, there is no evidence for a worldwide flood. Really? I'm just going to give you a few things. But one of the reasons they don't want to remember the worldwide flood, the way Peter instructs us to, is that it's a reminder that God judges sin. He does. God takes sin seriously, but we live in a culture that doesn't want to take it seriously. Oh, those are just little things. Oh, everything is relative. But God takes sin seriously. He judges it, sin. But also, if you understand the worldwide flood and flood geology, you see that it washes away millions and billions of years. And this is where they get, those secularists that are opposed to the Bible, this is where they get angry. Oh, you could maybe question evolution a little bit, but you start questioning millions of billions of years, well, the whole thing then falls apart if they don't have that. And the worldwide flood is the alternative way to interpret all that rock strata, that it was laid down rather quickly in the year of Noah's flood. It washes away millions of years. I'm told often, you know what, look around the world, it just looks old, doesn't it? And then people think of the different methods that have been used over the years, but we have better answers for all of that. And if you really think about what we see in the world, it doesn't look old, it looks flooded. Flooded. The sedimentary rock. Do we have evidence of that? Yes. The entire Earth, is covered with sedimentary rock, full of dead things. If you expected there to have been a worldwide flood, you would find rocks laid down by water full of dead things, right? That's what we see in the world. We also have rapid burial of creatures and plants. We have widespread, rapidly deposited layers. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about bent rock layers that defy millions of years. And there's more to this list. Others have as many as 8 or 10. But I just want to do a quick review with you. Ocean waters flooded over all of the land. Sedimentary rock. Every layer of the Grand Canyon, when you go there, you can see all those layers are all laid down by water, and from top to bottom, they're full of marine fossils and plants. If you expected there to have been a worldwide flood, that's exactly what you find, and we see it all over the world. We find carbon-14 in similar amounts from top to bottom. We know Mount St. Helens was formed in a matter of weeks. Some of the rock layers in hours, in just hours. And the world's tallest mountains are composed of ocean bottom sediments full of marine fossils. Fossilized clams on the top of Mount Everest. Isn't that amazing? What are they doing up there? Well, it's rocks laid down by water, and that water would have been at its own level. But after the end of the flood, with all the earthquakes and uplifting, plate tectonics, which we know a lot about today, these rock plates, these big continental plates crashed into each other and then buckled up the mountains from the Alps to the Rockies, to the Andes, and then the Himalayas as well. That's how this happens. And they don't look old. If they were millions, hundreds of millions of years old, let alone a billion, they would be eroded down to nothing. We know erosion happens. They wouldn't be this jagged at the very least. So the world's also full of fossil graveyards. The only way to get a fossil is if it's buried quickly and deeply. For example, if an animal dies in the forest, no human has touched it, will it become a fossil? No, otherwise the forest in Minnesota would be full of fossils of deer and rabbits and raccoons and so on. But no, when an animal dies, it gets eaten by other predators, and then it decomposes, and the first 20 inches or so of the ground is full of bacteria and worms and things that help all of this decompose. So you don't get quick fossils if it's just buried. It has to be buried deeply. And yet the world is full of fossil graveyards. This is an example from Dinosaur National Monument. And if you look at the bones, there's a lot of dinosaur bones all mishmashed. They're not like a dinosaur laid down and died and got covered. It's like they were in a mix master. And then in one big pile, all the bones mixed together, skulls smashed up a little bit, dismembered. They're laid down and dried out in this big pile, which we find a lot in the American West and elsewhere. And of course, mixed in are ocean, marine plants and fossils, plants and animals fossilized. We have fossil graveyards all over, and we have many examples of that. Just going to run through this. Next one is the rapid deposit strata. This is a polystrata fossil, a tree trunk that goes through all of these strata, including many layers in parts of the world. There are some of these tree trunks that are fossilized that go through coal seams in England. But yet we're told all of these seams and all these layers took hundreds of millions of years to form. What would happen to the tree if it did die and the tree trunk wasn't covered yet? Would it wait to be buried? No, of course not. It would decay, fall away, or be eaten by insects, or both. So polystrata fossils show rapid deposition of these rocks. How long does it take down the layers? Take a look. There's a person in a red shirt or blouse down there. How long did it take for these, let's call it 60-foot high cliff to be laid down? If you didn't know where it was, many people would say, well, that must have taken, hundreds of thousands of years to build all that up, and then eroded away on the one edge. And yet, this is from Mount St. Helens. That first layer, about where the yellow line is, was laid down in a matter of hours on May 18th, 1980. An aftershock occurred. The next layer was laid down on June 12th, 1980, and also in a matter of hours. And then a couple years later, there was another smaller eruption, and the next layer was laid down in a matter of hours. And of course, at that time is when a lot of these small canyons were formed. The next one I want to show you real quickly, which is one of my favorites, is bent rock. Now, if you have a nice big piece, slab of sandstone or limestone, can you bend it? No. Even if you're super strong, what would you do? You'd break it. It would crumble. And yet here we have many examples. There's people, and I've actually been at this site. Take a look. You can see the sediments laid down in water. Nobody disagrees with that, and that they normally would be level. Water seeks its own level and would go horizontal. But then here there was a fault, and the layers kind of dipped down, and then in a little dipsy-doo-dah, and then some of them go almost straight up from underground. And if you look at that and examine it, there's no sign of metamorphic change in the rock. It's still sedimentary rock. And it's not broken and crumbled. The only way to do that, and some other examples like this one, you can see here, that's a little close-up on one side. The rock's going practically almost virtual in that one, and here's another one. The only way that this can happen, and they say these rock layers could be millions of years old. So the bottom layers would be dried out, and then there's another event, or something happens, or some water builds up and lays down the next layer, layer. That's the uniformitarian geology approach. But the bottom layers would be hard as rock. They would be formed completely like rock, sandstone, limestone, what have you, and they wouldn't be waiting to get bent. The standard answer is that these were all buried deep underground and that they would be metamorphic rock, that they would be changed because of heat and pressure will allow them to bend. But if that did happen because of heat and pressure, the rock granules itself would be changed, and you could see it. There is no sign of that. But to make sure, some of you have heard of Is Genesis History, a marvelous documentary. Well, the same people just issued another documentary that came out this past winter, or last fall, called Mountains After the Flood. And again, Del Tackett interviews a number of scientists. They go to the Grand Canyon, formation of the Grand Canyon. But a major part of this documentary is following Dr. Andrew Snelling and a colleague on a research project where they got permission, and it took them years, but they got permission to take samples from that bent rock, analyze it, prepare the samples like in the lab for microstructures to analyze, is there metamorphic change or not? The only explanation, if there's not, is that these layers were all moist, like putting down a whole bunch of layers of modeling clay, and while the top to bottom is still a little moist and pliable, an earthquake comes along, or a fault bends the whole thing together and then goes on straight somewhere else. The only explanation for that would be Noah's flood. That's why I think bent rock, which we see around many places in the world, is a sign of Noah's flood. So Noah's flood accounts for the evidence, mass burials of dinosaurs, other animals, large schools of fish buried alive, such as in that picture, and that 95% of all fossils are marine plants and animals. So we do have evidence for the flood, but I want to move on to the question of what happened after the flood. Okay, we know Noah and his sons and daughter-in-laws got off the ark, and they probably used chunks of the ark to build shelter, and they started settling in this Middle East area. But there's another thing that happens, a major event, probably the last major event in Earth history, and that's the Ice Age. I've often heard questions like, was there really an Ice Age? And of course the secular world teaches, oh yeah, there was an Ice Age, but there were lots of them. They used to teach there were 4 or 5 and then 7, and now they're up to dozens of Ice Ages because they're trying to follow some technique that doesn't work on when the Earth could have been cold enough to have an Ice Age. But we'll look at that in a minute. What is an Ice Age? An Ice Age is just a great increase in snow and ice. On our planet now, the land is covered by about 10% ice or snow when you think of the Greenland ice caps and the polar ice caps. But during the Ice Age, at least 30% of the land mass on Earth was covered by ice and snow. And as I mentioned, it was probably the last major event in Earth history. It happened after the flood. So what does it take to make an Ice Age? You need to obviously have cooler summers where things are really cool. And that's the model that secular weather computer models of what could cause an Ice Age really concentrate on, because obviously it has to be colder to keep all that ice and snow. But you also need greater snowfall. You need lots and lots and lots of snow and ice and freezing rain throughout the winter months, so much that it can never thaw out during the summer months. And it persists for many years, perhaps centuries. As I mentioned, mainstream scientists do try to explain an Ice Age. They discount the flood, and because they do, they run into trouble. And they admit that. Although theories abound, no one really knows what causes an Ice Age, said David Alt from the glacial Lake Missoula and its homogeneous floods in his book of 2001. And then later, there's some articles, interviews on what causes Ice Ages. And here it was written, despite the efforts of marine geologists, atmospheric chemists, oceanographers, and more, no one knows what caused an Ice Age, or the Ice Ages as they prefer. And then Alan Mix, from an oceanographer at Oregon State, said, we've been chewing on this problem for 30 or 40 years. It's a killer, it's embarrassing, said Ralph Cicerone, the Dean of Physical Sciences at UC California, Irvine. They have no good clue because all their weather models, when you build in your assumptions and what could have caused it never gives them enough ice or snow, or if it does, it's in the wrong place because we have evidence of where glaciation was during the Ice Age and where it should be, where it should accumulate. And their models never do. Here's another quote, came from Nature, a very prestigious science magazine. They said, perhaps the longest standing puzzle in earth sciences is what caused the northern hemisphere ice sheets to come and go. They don't know. But can the biblical worldview explain an Ice Age? Yes, because this is what you need. You need warm oceans, not colder oceans, to provide excess evaporation of water. If you're going to have a lot of ice and snow buildup all winter long, that means you have to have moisture in the air. Warm oceans would provide that. The warmer the water, the more the evaporation goes up, goes over the land, and then falls as rain or mostly ice and snow during the northern and far southern parts of our planet. And again, more has to fall than can possibly melt in the summer months. And this has to happen basically for centuries to get an Ice Age. So, do we have the Genesis account give us the right things, the right ingredients to form an Ice Age? Well, the fountains of the great deep, the Bible mentions that first as the source of the water in the beginning of the flood. The fountains of the deep broke open from volcanism, heated water, and you have super hot water shooting up into the atmosphere, condenses or evaporates and then condenses over the land. But you also have to have cooler land, and that's the conundrum for the secular modelers, computer models, on their weather models. They don't want to admit to a flood, which is the mechanism to give you the hot oceans, like almost 30 degrees warmer than they are today, to get all that evaporation so that the computer model can say, oh yeah, this much is evaporating, this much is going over the land, and then falling all winter long. So you need a warm ocean, but you also need a cooler atmosphere and land. So what happens when volcanoes erupt? Besides heating everything at ground level around them, they throw up or shoot up lots of aerosols and dust and particles. We also believe we have evidence for large meteorites impacting the Earth during the flood and immediately thereafter. And when they explode, like the one in Yucatan, they shoot up particles that go way into the stratosphere and will linger in the air and in the atmosphere for years. And this mechanism will then persist, but then wanes over time. That's how you get the end of the ice age. So, Genesis records the fountains of the great deep and volcanism cause the warm ocean. They heat the water. This is a picture of a fairly large geyser, and some of you are familiar with Old Faithful in Yellowstone, right? Well, those geysers today would be small drinking fountains compared to the fountains of the deep breaking open. Superheated water coming up from underneath the ground. That's what caused Mount St. Helens to explode. You had water trapped in the rock, could not be easily released, but the magma coming up from underneath was heating it, and then things were shaking, and the final relief was a steam explosion that blew off the top third of the mountain. Steam, superheated water. Only here we have huge volcanoes all over the Earth. We have evidence of them. If you've been to Crater Lake, you know that's just a giant volcano, as well as the meteorites. Mike Ord, who was a weatherman in western United States, he was a meteorologist, and he has studied this a lot. And he said recent research of the Chicxulub impact has shown that it's likely ejected more aerosols into the stratosphere, resulting in greater global cooling. A huge impact will blast particles up into the stratosphere, which can cause this cooling. And then the volcanic aerosols right after the flood would be thick because of numerous violent eruptions that would have occurred in the flood and spread ash and aerosols far and wide, as reflected in evidence of ash beds in Mesozoic and Cenozoic sedimentary rocks. These are rocks that many would say were laid down during the end of the flood or the ice age, beginning of the ice age. So we have evidence of this. Big volcanoes shooting up. We also have meteorites coming down. We have the atmosphere being filled with volcanic and other aerosols dust. So this is how it looks. You got warm oceans. You got the sun up above being blocked. A lot of its light is being blocked by the dust clouds. In fact, when volcanoes go off today or in recent history, we talk about a summer without winter, which was documented, or a summer where they're in this area of the world where the one volcano went off does not get enough heat during the summer as normal. So if you think about this happening worldwide, you have the sun being reflected from the aerosols and the dust, and so the atmosphere below those clouds of dust, or even it's just hanging in the air, you don't get as much heat onto the lower atmosphere and the ground especially. So when you put it all together, here we do have on the right warm oceans, lots of evaporation, giving you the moisture you need for massive snowfalls all winter long. And as this moist air comes over the land is still cool because it's not getting the heat from the sun. And that's how you get the massive snowfalls, so much falling that it cannot melt away in the summer, and you have the beginning of an ice age. And if this persists for centuries, you get a real ice age. And we have evidence of that. Evidence of glaciation in many parts of the world that are not today. But remember, the oceans are still warm. So with the buildup of the ice and snow, it took some time. So for example, if it was 50 years after the flood, people have estimated that there are only favorable areas where the ice and snow would build up in significant amounts, and those are mostly inland and at higher elevations. So you see the white-capped mountains in North Asia and North America, and then you see the inland fields, especially Canada, would have been good candidates for the ice and snow to build up and not melt away in the summer. Maybe 100 years later, it looks like this. You've got more pockets. Western Asia is building up. You've got the mountains with even more. And eventually, it's been estimated about 200 years after the flood, you finally get a full-blown ice age, where North America is significantly covered with ice and snow, glaciers, significant glaciers in the mountains and the mountain passages. Notice one thing about this chart. The ice and the snow, even during the Ice Age, does not extend to the coasts. The coasts can stay dry. Not dry, they're wet, but they stay warmer because of the effect of the warm oceans. It's even today, if you went to Alaska, how many have been on an Alaskan cruise, right? Yeah, look, a whole bunch of you. I did that too. And you go to Ketchikan and some of those places, Juneau and north of there, they talk about it being a rainforest. They don't get a lot of snow, but they get a lot of moisture, but it's warm enough. It's warmed by the ocean even still today. Well, with warmer oceans, you'd get even more rain, you get snow inland, but the coast would not be ice and snow covered. And then here's another picture, what they think Europe may have looked like. You can see all the ice and snow in the Alps, in that alpine area, much heavier and deeper than we ever have in winter today. And of course, Scandinavia, almost all ice and snow covered. You can go there and see, in Sweden, you can see granite been scraped away by glaciers and ice moving across, scraping it, and you can see the marks in the stone as the huge layers with all that weight, and it's dirty, it's full of pebbles and other things, scraping the granite. And you see that in different parts of the world. But what happens when you have so much water tied up in the ice and snow caps? The ocean level will go down. So during the Ice Age is when you have lower ocean levels and people can walk across what we call land bridges to many sections of the globe. This is the mechanism that allows the Babel dispersion, which, remember, I would estimate that began about 200 to 220 years after the flood, during the days of Peleg, as it said. Two sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because in his time the earth was divided. Now I would put it at the middle of Peleg's life. You wouldn't name an era or 1 or 2 centuries after a person when they're born because you don't know what they're going to do. But obviously he became significant in that culture, and they called it the days of Peleg. So let's just go with a good simple number. The middle of the Peleg's life, you go with the chronological, the dates of who was born, who begat whom. You end up with about 220 years after the flood. And I have modeled what the population could be if you start with 8 people after the flood, or even just 6, the sons and daughter-in-laws of Noah. You can easily, with their lifetimes, just having children, up until age 60, even though when they lived hundreds of years, you can easily get hundreds of thousands of people, enough to build cities in the Middle East and to begin building the Tower of Babel. So some people say 100 years was the Tower of Babel after the flood. I think that is too short. You wouldn't have enough people to really start building cities again. It's more like 200 years into the middle of the life of Peleg. And when it says that in those days the earth was divided, it's not talking about the physical earth. That happened during the flood. We have the mid-Atlantic ridge today, which pushed apart North and South America from Europe and Africa. And that ocean ridge down the middle, following the middle of the Atlantic, continues to push the continents apart. But during the flood, it would have been extremely quickly. Dr. Baumgartner has computer models, he's a geophysicist, and shows how that would have worked. And what we see, they're still moving, but it's just a fraction of what it once was when the earth was divided physically. I think what it's saying here, the earth was divided in the days of Peleg, is the population now was being divided. Instead of staying in one place and not moving apart the way God wanted them to do, to populate the earth, he said, no, you're going to move and I'll confound your languages at the Tower of Babel, and that then dispersed the people. And people in one language went one way and others went other ways. And because of these land bridges, you could walk, tribes of people could walk, follow animals and game, and walk all the way, if you followed the right path, from Southeast Asia to Australia. The water is shallow enough that when the lower ocean levels, it would be possible, as well as walk from Europe to Ireland. Here's a European map. And if you look carefully, the light gray around England and Scandinavia, and a little bit to the lower right outside of China, those are continental shelves now where the water is relatively shallow, but during the Ice Age, it would have been exposed. People could walk on that, and animals spread across the earth. Ice Age, maybe that's why God did this, to help facilitate the movement of people and animals all across the earth. Here's the Siberian-Alaska land bridge. How many of you heard of that? Most everybody has at one time. Well, it's a lot bigger than I actually thought when I was first hearing about it. This is from a secular source. And the Siberian land bridge, or the Bering Sea land bridge, was quite big. It's north to south, it's almost as wide as Alaska is, and that's big. And in fact, they now say, from Scientific American, that people lived on that land bridge. They came across all of Asia, found a nice area. Remember, they stayed close to the oceans, which was not glaciated, and then they found some fertile land in those days. They had plenty of rain from the warm oceans, and they could live there for a while. Now here, obviously, they need thousands of years. I would think it was probably only a few centuries that people settled there. Others kept moving until you get to the Americas and coming down from Alaska through Canada, settling in the American West and all the way down to Peru. So that's what happened. The Alaska land bridge, water tied up in all that ice and snow allowed this dispersion. And you've all heard of woolly mammoths stuck in the snow and ice, right? We have woolly mammoths in North Siberia, close to that land bridge, and even on islands we have tusks. They could cross over, and then they get caught. People kept going. But really, we only have about 50 woolly mammoth carcasses, and you've heard of them, and we can study them. And most of them, even in Siberia, northern Siberia, again close to the coast, they have buttercups and grass in their stomachs. Do buttercups and grasses grow in northern Siberia? Well, not today. It's permafrost and so on. But yet they found food and nourishment because they followed the coastlines along with the people. In fact, there was some high ground, which is now islands. In the northern Siberian islands, and especially Wrangel Island, we find thousands of these mammoth tusks. Now look at the darker blue. That would have been the land bridge. You could walk across the coast. If you look up where the islands are, where it was not glaciated, especially in eastern Siberia, walked to that high ground of Wrangel Island, and all of that, and even coming down to the Bering Sea, would have been dry ground. So people could spread out, live there for a while, and many of them would continue moving on to see what's over the next hill. People just love to explore, so we kept doing that. But the woolly mammoths, they were still there. They were happy eating buttercups and hay and everything. But then the water started rising as the Ice Age ended, and that probably took pretty much get close to where we are today. It's estimated probably about 100 years. So these woolly mammoths living on that relatively low ground, but still dry with grass fields and so on, up on the coast of the Arctic Sea. Remember, the water was warm enough that it was not frosted. You had rain and you could grow things so that the woolly mammoths and other animals had something to eat, and they were happy. But then the water started coming in, the lowlands started getting marsh-like, filling in with water, and then that's why we find so many woolly mammoths and other animals, small animals, stuck in what was once marsh. Now it's frozen, and some of it's underwater today. So you can see the brown, the gray, that's the coast today. You could go out to what's now Wrangel Island, and as the water went up between that high ground and the rest of Siberia, water seeped in, and the animals that were closer to the island kept getting into a smaller and smaller high ground until you finally end up with it surrounded by water at the end of the Ice Age. And that's why we find thousands of woolly mammoth tusks on a relatively small island in north of Siberia. So the land bridge is a big deal, and only the Ice Age accounts for that, with all the water tied up in the ice and snow, the ice caps. Now here's a recent article that I just discovered. Not only were woolly mammoths, small animals and mammals, saber-toothed tigers, and people crossing the land bridges, so were dinosaurs. How many of you seen my talk or someone else's on all the evidence that dinosaurs and people coexisted? About 3 or 4 or 5 of you. Well, we have it. We have biological soft tissue in dinosaur bones indicating they cannot be that old. And so here we even had a very common dinosaur, the Admonasauruses, and probably Hadrosaurs, similar, crossing that same land bridge, because we're finding their bones now between modern-day Russia and North America. And that's from a scientist in Japan. So when we look at the Ice Age, Dr. Ord, or Mr. Ord, he's a master's MS degree, he looks at some of the modeling that he can do with the warm oceans, and his best guess is about 500 years for the Ice Age. But remember, it took about 200 years to really get going so that the land bridges would be uncovered, and that's about the time people had to move from the Tower of Babel. Got it? So total time, post-flood, we're talking about 700 years. What's interesting about the Ice Age and the immediate time after the Ice Age, ocean's still a little bit warmer, is that places like the Sahara, North Africa, would have been lush and green. Warm oceans giving more rain than we certainly have today. So this area of the Sahara Desert was once wet or green. We have satellite pictures that provide evidence of large lakes and rivers that are now mostly buried by sand. Fossils from the Ice Age have been found in the Sahara of snails, fish, elephants, giraffes, buffaloes, and aquatic hippopotamuses. Or is it hippopotami? I don't know. But we find these things, and human artifacts. Thousands of rock petroglyphs have been found suggesting the population of a then lush Sahara region was pretty large. Pretty large. But as the Ice Age ended, the rain stopped being less frequent in this area. It dried out, and today we find desert. The Bible also records a certain time when the Middle East was more lush and more snow. The Bible doesn't mention an ice age the way we think of it, but we do have people talking about ice and snow in a land where there's hardly any of it in today. So in Job, several times it says, for to the snow, he says, God says, to the snow, fall on the earth. And then Job says, the breath of God produces the ice and the broad waters become frozen. It's a little poetic, but the point is clear. There was ice and snow, broad waters even freezing over, which doesn't happen today in the Middle East. And then in Job 38, have you entered the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of the hail? This is where God's answering Job and talking about the wonders of nature, and all this snow comes down from heaven that he saw. Where does it come from? The storehouses of the hail and snow. In Jeremiah 18:14, the first part of the verse, there's an interesting comment about what's supposed to be obvious. And the phrase there is, does the snow of Lebanon ever vanish from its rocky slopes? Talking about a time when the mountains of Lebanon were covered by snow, snow-capped mountains year-round. Now today, and in the last 100 years or more since we've known it, it does snow on the mountains of Lebanon. But at about 6,500 feet, it only stays around on average about 4 months of year. And above 2,500 meters or 8,000 feet, the larger mountains in Lebanon, there is snow for about half of the year, sometimes more, sometimes less. But you wouldn't talk about those mountains being snow-covered year-round, yet Jeremiah did. I think that's a sign that they had some influence from an ice age. So if you put it all together, we've got a pre-flood climate that we know is very lush, lots of vegetation. We wouldn't have the coal fields today without that. Huge forests, vegetation, big animals growing bigger and bigger, like the dinosaurs and even other things. And people living a longer time with that climate. But then we have the flood incident, and then we have a transitional climate during which we have the ice age. Warm oceans, cold atmosphere and land produces an ice age. You need a flood to explain that. And then it slowly transitions to where the climate is today. Now, have you ever wondered where you'd put that into the Bible timeline? I did. So I started looking it up and getting these numbers together. So here you have the biblical timeline from Adam to Joseph, based on what the Bible says, how old somebody was when they had the next generation that they talk about, and then how long they lived before they had the next generation, and how long they lived. So a little bit to the right, of the middle, you have the first tall vertical black line. That is the flood event, about 2350 BC. That's Methuselah was called up to heaven. He's gone. Lamech is gone. But Noah is still there with his 3 sons, and Shem being one of them. And it's his descendants that get noted all the way down to Abraham. So if you go with a little close-up of this area and try to put this into a timeline of the biblical story, if the flood's at 2350 BC, give or take, I'm not saying that's the perfect day or year, but then you have about 220 years, you have the beginning of the Ice Age and the Babel event. People start going across the continent at that time. They find the land bridges, or at least their descendants do, in the next 50 to 100 years, and they keep moving across the globe, even walking to Australia. They couldn't go all the way to New Zealand because the water does get too deep, but it would have been a lot closer, and people did know how to build boats. So the Ice Age ends roughly 700 years after the flood. When is that? It's the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is in Egypt. He's ruling. He knows he's about to die, gives some final instructions. He wants his bones to be carried back to the promised land when the Israelites are ready to go back. And if you've ever watched any of the Patterns of Exodus movies by Mahoney, they're excellent on the book of Exodus, and he talks about the bones of Joseph. There's a tomb that looks like it's Joseph's tomb in Egypt, but it's empty. Why is it empty? Oh yeah, the Israelites were supposed to take his bones back when they left 420 years later. So, as you read the book of Genesis and you read about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the early part of Joseph's life, you realize that's when the Ice Age was going on. Middle East was lush. That's why the Egyptians built a great dynasty there. That kind of ends, the Ice Age ends, as you get to the end of Genesis and the closing of that book while Joseph is still there. Okay? So a little summary. The Ice Age can only be explained by a worldwide flood. You need that for the warm oceans. And even though our culture despises the idea of a flood, it's a very real event. Just like the flood itself and then the Ice Age. One Ice Age lasting about 500 years after the flood. And if you understand this, and we can believe Genesis, then we can believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And if you do that, you accept Christ as your Savior to take care of that sin problem, and you can go to heaven. But you have to accept Him, don't you? So you don't need hundreds of thousands of years for an ice age. There was only one Ice Age, lasting not tens of thousands of years or whatever number they pick today. And as I mentioned, it's still a mystery for evolutionary science, long ages. They have no mechanism that recreates all that ice and snow and glaciers where it's supposed to be, where the evidence is, and not along the coasts. Only the flood provides the right mechanisms and the transitional climate. And it's also interesting to note, glaciers and ice caps have been melting for thousands of years. It's not just in the last 50 years. They've been melting for thousands of years. But a lot of it is still there, right? So what about modern climate change, right? The climate has always been changing. The oceans have been getting cooler to the point that they're pretty much now in equilibrium, but we still have rain and snow in different parts of the world. And you know what? When I was in the 1970s, when I was much younger, they said, oh, the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro are going to be gone in 40 years. I think they said that in the 90s. Well, the snows of Kilimanjaro are still there. So what did they do? We're getting all this preaching about how climate change is real, and we've got to do something about it now. President Obama, when he was president in 2015, in his State of the Union address said, climate change is the greatest threat to future generations. And maybe some of you have heard of AOC, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She declared that the world had 12 years to fix carbon emissions, or we would hit a point of no return. We're going to die. Well, look at the graph. I mean, it does look alarming. And this is what often was used to scare people in the early 2000s. They said, look, it's now 2005, let's say. The last 40 years, the average Earth temperature has gone up quickly. Look, it was low in the 70s, and now it's way high. Look at that red line. Oh, we've got to do something fast. And of course, they blame carbon dioxide, which is a whole other question, but they said we got to do something. And in fact, the truth is, if you go to the 1970s, how many of you remember all of the articles about the next ice age? There were people getting their PhDs on the thesis about the next ice age because it was looking like temperatures were coming down drastically. These are just 4 different issues of Time magazine. The big freeze. How are we going to survive the coming ice age? If you believe in multiple ice ages and the mechanisms that they have, even though they don't work, but if you believe it, well, there could be another ice age coming, and the temperatures seem to indicate that. But now let's look at the graph for the average temperatures for 120 years or so. You can see there is a slight uptrend, but it's much more moderate only half a degree Celsius in the last 120 years, which is in line with what's happened many times in Earth's history after a cooling period and a warming period. But look at the low point in the 1970s. There's a cycle, up, down, over many decades. So if you were selective, and when you begin your graph, like in the early 70s, you would show just that little part, wouldn't you? Right there in the yellow highlighted area. Wow, look, we're going down. So you see that red line in the middle, or close to the middle? That's when they thought we were going into an ice age. But then, like before, we're going up and down. Now we've come up and we've basically flattened out. That's why they call it climate change and not global warming anymore, because they know you can't count on the global warming. But you see how they scared people? Even if it's a 40 or 50-year graph, a trend line? Oh, but the planet is big, and you need more data than just a small sample of 40 years. If you go to 120 years, you see a totally different story. But that's not what they told us. Now, a little less than a year ago, July 4th, 2023, how many of you saw the headlines? We just had the hottest day ever on the planet Earth. How many of you saw those headlines? Do you remember any of those? Yeah, there's a few of you. They were all over. Minneapolis Star Tribune, is that your paper? They would have had stories about it. This is from the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. Everybody was picking up on this story. The hottest day ever. Well, how do you know? What was the temperature 1,000 years ago? Do you have good data on that? No, they don't. But every news source carried this story, and it was an outright lie. No reporter called up the news source and asked if this is true. It was presented as a fact, but what is it based on? Those numbers for the hottest day ever? Based on computer model speculation. Computer modeling. And it all came from a single source. They used different types of data, but they blended and reanalyzed the data to give an alarming but unsubstantiated result. The temperature given in this news release was actually 5 degrees warmer, more than actual temperatures when it was checked. But nobody in the media checks it because it fits their narrative. The story came from the Climate Reanalyzer at the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. The University of Maine's Climate Reanalyzer is not an official US government source of data, and it doesn't even produce original data. They just collect data from different sources, put it into their computer models, and then reframes the data based on their assumptions. Their assumptions about the past, their assumptions about what's going on now, their assumptions that CO2 is a big change in our climate, causes big changes. Did they have any way of verifying this? How many of you remember the early days of computing? I do. I wrote computer simulation programs, big things, models of factories, conveyor systems, paint systems. I was involved in a lot of that. I wrote simulations for all kinds of stuff, as well as big programs. There was a common acronym that was going around in the early days of computer, because you could hand somebody, a manager in a large company, a computer printout, and they would go, oh, the computer said that? It must be right. Right? Well, the computer said it. Well, how many of you remember G-I-G-O? GIGO. It's only the people with gray hair remember that. Let's revive that. What does G-I-G-O stand for? GIGO? Your assumptions, the data you plug in, will change the result and not give you accurate results. That's why you want to verify a computer model before you publish it or tell management this is what it says. You verify the model, you try to recreate things that you do know about, and then you submit the model and say this is what it's predicting. But if you put in garbage with bad assumptions or even inadequate data, what are you going to get? Same thing you put in, garbage out. So let's revive that when people talk about all the computer models. Let me see your assumptions. Let me see the raw data. As an engineer, I love to do that because it's amazing what you find in assumptions. So where did the data come from? Well, if the mainstream media had checked with the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, about the claims of this record-setting heat, they would have said, nope, surface temperature does not confirm. Global high temperature records were broken in early July. The data that they used and the reanalyzation of the data based on their assumptions was wrong. And yet every news source in the world picked up on it. Fear-mongering to support a political agenda. Now, we still use a lot of data, and some of the data comes from surface stations. But we know that runs hot because they're in urban areas now. And they're like heat sinks. The heat just keeps building up. And these overheated stations, bad data is even still lower than what the climate models predict. So in other words, I know I've got bad data from many surface stations around the country and even the world now. I know it's showing too hot, but even that is cooler than the computer models they use to predict climate change. So that it tells you again, oh, garbage in, garbage out. Surface station readings do not match temperatures recorded by global satellites and weather balloons. Those are much better sources, and those two do match each other pretty well. But they're always cooler than most of the station or land-based station monitoring points. And in 2009, an award-winning meteorologist named Anthony Watts determined that 89% of the stations that were measuring data that the NOAA uses, they failed to meet the National Weather Service's own citing requirements or quality information. And he alerted 89% of the stations are giving you bad data, and then you're trying to model it with that. Garbage in, garbage out. And it's still true today. He wrote another paper, 2022. Yeah, they changed some of the stations, they did this and that, but they also picked up stations that were reporting temperatures that were totally unsubstantiated, that were even further away from the quality standards that the National Weather Service itself publishes. Caught red-handed. One of the reasons, in one of my talks, I talk about the rise of science after the Reformation, and that men of science have led to breakthroughs in science. And one of the things, there's 8 criteria. One of the earlier ones is that you have to believe there is a God of order who created things and that we can evaluate and learn from nature on what the God of order made, and we can find the equations, the things and how the universe and our planet run. But the 8th item that's critical for the advancement of science is that we do not bear false witness. We publish data honestly and let others make something useful with it, find the errors, correct them, and we move on to better and better improvements in technology and science. But if you falsify your data, if you do not believe that there's anything wrong with bearing false witness to your colleagues in the scientific community because you'll get more funding, we have a problem, and this is getting worse. I know people doing this in the field of genetics, get more funding. They publish the data about some of their research, but it's not true. And it doesn't help science. The Heartland Institute has exposed, and you can read about this at the Cornwall Alliance website, has exposed instances in both the US and abroad where official agencies tamper with past data at what could be good stations but they want the past data to look lower. So they tampered with it. And this has been proven. This is an article from just this month. And they adjust the records to be colder than was actually recorded. They mess with the data today so that they manipulate, and they also manipulate current temperatures upward so that the temperature gradient is like this. The past temperatures they make lower. The current temperature is a little bit higher, so you get that steeper curve. Oh no, we're going to melt. That's what's going on. Integrity of the data. So folks, remember this. The hottest year on record is still 1936, in the middle of the Dust Bowl days. If you've ever seen a documentary, look for one. If you haven't, the Dust Bowl days were pretty severe and pretty hot and dry, in the middle of America especially, contributing to the Depression. Took World War II to get us out of that. The real hottest time of the year that we've had, well before the Industrial Revolution could have heated things up with all the carbon, was 1936, and in those Dust Bowl years, you see that in the 1930s and up until 1940. Then we have the declining trend. That's when everybody got worried about an ice age, and lately it's gone back up to where it was, but not as high as 1936. And we do have this cycle. That's all that's going on. You remember Al Gore's Oscar-winning documentary, Inconvenient Truth? What do you win an Oscar for, by the way? Acting? Oh, okay. Well, there's a guy named John Kerr, a chemical engineer. So he spent 2 years after that movie came out to verify this. I mean, the claims that Gore made and others were pretty severe. If this is true, I want to know about it. But I'm not going to take it on faith by a politician. So he checked the data, and he wrote the book, The Inconvenient Skeptic, a comprehensive guide to the Earth's climate, and you can look that up, published in 2011. And then a couple of others wrote a declaration. There is no climate emergency, and that includes Gregory Wrightstone, Master of Science, a geologist, who wrote The Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. And then a Dr. Sangster, an electrical engineer, doctorate, said the real inconvenient truth, it's warming, but it's not CO2. The case for human-caused global warming and climate change is based on lies, deceit, and manipulation. They just want to fear you. And unfortunately, our younger generation, that's all they've heard. Teachers are teaching it. I've had grandkids and nieces talk about what they've been learning in school, and I say, well, this isn't quite right. Well, the teachers are given the material and they have to teach it. So a Nobel Prize winner, Dr. John Clauser, he signed this Clintel World Climate Declaration that says there is no climate emergency. If you're interested in this, you can look him up, learn about it, Clintel, CLINTEL.org, and get their news. Get the alternative side of the story, because you don't get a true picture otherwise, do you? How many of you heard that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia was dying because of the warm oceans? Yeah, well, I went there and I saw a lot of color still, snorkeling over it. And now, 2023, the world's largest reef secretly recovers and has had record high coral for 2 years in a row. That's why you don't hear about that too much anymore, right? And then, in 1984, the world polar bear population was estimated at 25,000, and in the early 2000s, we were told that polar bears are dying, and they showed this poor polar bear sitting on an ice floe as ice melts around it. Well, the real data shows in 2018, not that long ago, the global population of polar bears is up 30,000. They're doing just fine, thank you. See, climate alarmists have always made predictions, and they've always been wrong. In 1970, a famous Harvard biologist, George Wald, warned, civilization exhaustion will end in 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken. 54 years later, we're still here, right? Pinch myself, I'm here. There is no climate emergency. A global network of over 1,800 scientists and professionals in this field have signed this. And they have said climate science should be less political and the policies be more scientific. Scientists address uncertainties and exaggerations. You should not allow others to exaggerate their claims. Not if you want to be scientific. And politicians should remove their emotions and count the real cost of their proposals versus the imagined benefits of their policy measures. This network of 1,800 scientists and professionals in this field say that natural as well as human cause factors do cause some warming, but it's all in line with previous warming periods. And warming is far slower than predicted. Nothing that you have to be concerned about. And of course, climate policy relies on very inadequate, poorly done models with bad input. Garbage in, garbage out. CO2 is not a pollutant. If you're a biologist, if you know anything about photosynthesis, you know you need CO2. Do you love trees? I love trees. Well, if you love trees, then go hug one and breathe on it, and it will hug you back because it loves the CO2 in your breath. It does. It needs it. Agriculture benefits actually from a little more CO2. CO2 is only 0.04%. And yet they say, well, it's gone up so much. Well, percentage-wise, when you go from 0.02% or 0.025 to 0.04%, percentage-wise, you can calculate a big number that way. But it's still tiny. How many people know what the biggest greenhouse gas is in our atmosphere? Water vapor. So if the President Biden wants to stop global warming, he should ban the oceans from evaporating water. Well, that would work if you could do it. Climate policy must respect scientific and economic realities. And all of these things, when you hear about tornadoes and hurricanes, oh, come on, we've had them before and they've been huge. How many of you heard of the great hurricane that wiped out Galveston? That was what, about 1904, 1908, somewhere in there? That was a monster hurricane. After Katrina, they said, we're going to have hurricanes every year like this. In the next 5 years, none. Let's be real. If you want to read more about it, go to the co2learningcenter.com or the cornwallalliance.org. Great resources. Get the other side. Even if you don't want to take everything they say at face value, at least look where the data is. You've heard Obama and others say 98% of all scientists say there's global warming, global change is happening. I read that paper. It's a garbage paper, at least nothing big that you would take any conclusion from. What they did, the author did, is use computer modeling to search scientific articles that talk about this, and then he looked up the names of some of the people and said, okay, they believe in global warming, and therefore 96% of all scientists believe in global warming. You've heard that, right? All scientists. How many scientists ended up in his final pool? About a dozen. Is that statistically valid? Not at all. There was no poll taken with specific questions of thousands of scientists, and yet 1,800 scientists are opposed to all this silliness. Global warming, glacial melt have been happening for centuries. The amount of global warming in the last 120 years has been about 0.5 C, in line with changes from the last global cooling period. It's nothing to get alarmed about. And in fact, the sun variation has more to do with our warming And there is no correlation to the CO2 data if you really look at it. 1936 was still the hottest point on record. And finally, CO2 is necessary for life, for photosynthesis. The war on CO2 is a war against life. Your life, your grandchildren's life. I get alarmed when they talk about capturing CO2. Here in the Midwest, they want to build these big things that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Are you trying to kill the trees? Do you want agriculture to have less food produced? I think that is what they want. But they're selling it to us as we're going to protect the planet. A global network of over 1,800 scientists, not the dozen or so, they oppose the alarmists who have a political agenda, and it's the alarmists whose predictions have always been wrong. So don't be alarmed. Don't let them scare you. Just say, let's look at the data a little closer. What do other scientists say who are real experts in the weather? Meteorologists, the majority, do not believe in man-made global warming. They weren't asked about that 98% number or whatever it was. And even so, no matter what happens, if the alarmists, the globalists, Satanists who want to destroy the food supply, who have said in the Great Reset they want to reduce the world's population, even if they are successful, remember God's word. He's in control. And we can trust him for our eternity. They can't unless they repent and come to Jesus. And that's the ultimate point here. That's the point. We do have a creator who judges sin in a worldwide flood and will continue to judge it. But he does give us a way out because he loves us. Without taking away our free will, we can choose to have our sin forgiven by accepting Christ into our hearts and Savior. I hope you have. And if you have, you don't have to worry about this. Yeah, we should oppose it where we can, peacefully, and with truth and graciousness, but we don't have to go playing Chicken Little, right? 2 Peter, where I began, closes with his admonition to grow in the grace and in the knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. To him be the glory, both now, forever, and ever. So folks, what are you going to put your trust in? God's word, which changeth not, which stays true and consistent? Or man's word, which is always changing, always something else? The Bible has stood the test of time and science. Study it, believe it, defend it. And if you agree with me, say amen. Amen. And if you don't agree with me, check it out. You owe it to yourself. For one thing, your eternity is at stake, right? Not just, how you're going to live the next 10 years. Thank you. I appreciate it. Some of you know about this. About 7 of my talks have been recorded and then edited. One of them that I list here, Chimp versus Human DNA, that was actually recorded online at a presentation to Twin City Creation. But I have Human Genetics, Planet of the Apes, I go through the bones, Atheism and the Origin of Life, powerful information that shows atheism is a religious belief. It's not rooted in science. Dinosaurs, and then fossils, and then carbon-14 and the age of the Earth. Those presentations are on that one thumb drive. Then there's some other videos, some bonus videos that are really good, like 9 or 10 minute ones. And then I have written up some PDF documents on carbon-14, radiometric dating, a little one on dinosaurs, and a few other topics. That's all on one thumb drive, and it's going to be over there. If you don't have any of these DVDs, I suggest you get at least one for your home library. I hope you still have a DVD player. Not everybody does, I know. That's why I put my stuff on a thumb drive. But Is Genesis History? How many of you seen that documentary with Del Tackett from Focus on the Family? Excellent. I know almost all of the scientists that he interviews on location, Grand Canyon, Mount St. Helens, zoos, museums, and marine parks. Excellent stuff. And then Dismantled is relatively new, interviews with scientists, and they discuss why Darwinism can't be true from their field of science, including Dr. Sanford, who is a world-class geneticist. And then Evolution's Achilles' Heels is a similar format but different topics. Excellent resources if you don't have those and you want a DVD. So, that's enough of the commercial. Thank you. It's been great to be with you. God bless you. And maybe we'll see you again.